I don't know if you remember those like BuzzFeed quizzes. I was like, well, I want this one, so I'm just gonna put this answer. And my sister was like, well, what do you mean? And she was like, but that's lying. And I was like, but it's not lying. I can always find
It's a
some truth in
it's a
it.
it's a BuzzFeed test. It doesn't matter if you're being honest on a BuzzFeed test. Hey, it's Adrian. Welcome back to ADHD School, where being normal is just that little bit overrated. Let me introduce you to Clover Pfaff. Now, Clover is 15, going on approximately 50.
Get off the stage! I want to, but I can't!
She is the most well-spoken 15-year-old I've ever met. Now, I first met her through an interview I did through my pageant business with both her and her older sister, Gracie.
And this is our interview with the Pageant Project.
At the time when I interviewed her, she was only 14. And I think what's going to strike you, as it struck me, she doesn't speak like any 14-year-old I've ever met. She's witty, she's articulate, and she's very, very well spoken. Now, here are the three things I want you to get from this interview. Number one, Clover has ADHD, obviously, and you'll hear the various struggles that she's had with the condition. And her older sister Gracie always described her as brave, and I didn't quite understand that until I did this interview with her. There's this misnomer that someone with ADHD must present in a certain way. The classic one, as I said with Angel's interview, is that someone with ADHD can't possibly do well at school and can't focus.
Can be yellow if they're using late season apples. And of course in Canada the whole thing's flip-flop.
Now, Clover obviously has had struggles, but she is incredibly driven. She wants to be a PhD twice over, one in ichthyology and one in marine biology, and I didn't even know what ichthyology was.
My God! I'm losing my perspicacity!
But just because someone doesn't present in the stereotypical ADHD way, and just because they look like they've got it all together on the surface, doesn't mean they're not struggling with those issues. Number two, if you are a parent who has a child with a recent ADHD diagnosis, or you know a parent who might be going through the same, I think this is really interesting to look at from a parent's point of view. Because Gracie, the older sister, doesn't have ADHD, and I talked to Clover a little bit about how her mum and dad communicate differently with Clover versus Gracie, but also Clover's dad himself has ADHD. And so you have this interesting and potentially tricky dynamic in the family where two of them have ADHD and two of them don't.
2 + 2 is 4.
Third thing, and related to parenting, is the fact that Clover basically has been homeschooled her entire life. I think she managed 3 days of preschool before she became interminably bored.
Oh my God, I care so little I almost passed out.
And said, I never want to go back to school again, this isn't for me. And so she's been homeschooled her entire life, and by her own admission, she doesn't think she would have fit in or done nearly as well in the traditional schooling system.
Yes, science!
Now, obviously, being able to homeschool your children is a giant luxury, but I think in the case of someone like Clover, you can really see how much she's flourished and that the cost of homeschooling in terms of time and effort was more than worth the reward. Now, as usual, I'd love it if you could join our ADHD community at adhdschool.com. That's school with a K. Just drop your email address in there. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback on this interview, drop them in the comments below. How did you find yourself responding to that pressure? Because as I've been looking more into ADHD, it's become quite apparent that ADHD people seem to perform best under pressure, but it almost sounds like you enjoyed it.
I did. I really enjoy working under pressure. I do my best with deadlines. I also have anxiety, so sometimes I do get a little stressed out beforehand, but when I'm actually in the middle of something, I find myself enjoying it more than being stressed out by it. Deadlines give me something to work towards and get even better at. So by the end of the day, I was like, how quickly can I get this done and move on to touch-ups? It almost became a challenge in my head of how quickly and how well I can do something. And I really enjoy working under pressure, but I also love a good leisurely time to, if I want to do my makeup for 3 hours, I can.
How good are you at relaxing?
I do struggle to relax. I have to be either doing something or forcing myself to relax, kind of, but I also really, really love reading, so I can pretty much get completely lost in a book, and it's 3 hours later, and I'm like, wow, I finished that. That was so good. And my mom would just be like, did you do anything else today?
Are you able to impose deadlines on yourself and then stick to them, or do they need to be more external? So, for example, with the makeup comp, it's more of an external deadline, right? The comp tells you you've got 10 minutes or 20 minutes. But I know a lot of ADHD people seem to struggle with actually setting goals and prioritization. Are you able to put those same sort of deadlines on yourself, or have you found it's better when it sort of comes from the environment being structured in a certain way?
I can put deadlines on myself, but I do tend to do better with external deadlines. If I need to do something and I know that somebody else isn't going to give me that deadline, I'll kind of say, you have to do it by this time because of this, or I'll almost pretend like I have something going on so that I can say this is why it has to be done. But yeah, I definitely do struggle with internal deadlines, but I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
I also want to ask you about the reading. There are a lot of people with ADHD who struggle with reading. You don't. So have you ever given any thought to why that's the case?
So, as much as I love reading, I actually do struggle with it sometimes, but it tends to differ. Sometimes I will completely just have no problem be able to breeze through a book and whatnot, and then other times I'll read the same sentence over and over and over again, and I just can't get anywhere, or my eyes will jump on a page. And I think part of it has to do with the reading material, if it's something that I really am interested in versus something that maybe I have to read or I'm not fully enthralled in yet. But my brain changes up on the daily. Sometimes one morning I'll be able to fly through a reading assignment, and then even just later that day, my eyes are jumping all around. And so I think it's a big balance of the right environment for whatever I'm doing and just how my brain decides to work at that moment.
To what extent have you found that managing your ADHD is kind of like an ongoing process? It seems like more of a balancing act than, oh, I've got ADHD, here's some medication, here's some strategies, and now it's fixed forever.
Absolutely. I also don't love taking my medication, if I'm being honest. It's pretty rare that you'll find me on it because I feel like it really tampers my creativity. And I think a lot of my wit and not just my creativity, but my enthusiasm comes from having ADHD. So sometimes when I'm on my medication, I feel not necessarily like a zombie, which I've heard other people say, but more just like an overly calm version of myself, which can definitely be good for some scenarios. But I feel like I'm just more fun with ADHD. So I think that could definitely be part of it. But I think that managing ADHD just comes with what works best for you. There's
Yeah.
sometimes I feel like sometimes people think that everybody with ADHD is the exact same and that, oh, they just can't focus or they just need medication or whatever it might be. But really, everybody's different and different things work for different people. So sometimes somebody needs the medication and that is what works perfectly for them and they have no issues whatsoever. Sometimes medication doesn't work at all, or sometimes it makes them feel like a different version of themselves. And
Yeah.
sometimes somebody just needs to have the right environment for their brain to work. Like for me, I it changes on the daily, but I typically either have to have a completely silent environment or constantly musical environment. So sometimes it's that I have to just
Mm.
be by myself, 100%, no noise. And then other times it has to be that I have to have like classical music or something going on in the background. I found
Yeah.
that for schoolwork, classical music is amazing for my brain to focus. And if I have like a quiz or something, I will listen to the same song that I was listening to while I studied as I'm taking the test, and
Ah,
it almost makes me remember more. Yeah, I just think that finding the right and balanced environment for your ADHD is really what helps to kind of calm it down a little bit and allows me to focus. And I know that that's not always the most practical, which is why people do give options for people with ADHD, which I'm very grateful
yeah.
for. But yeah, I think being homeschooled also has allowed me to really learn what works best for me because if I need to get up and go do 25 jumping jacks or go run around the block or something to fix my brain, I can.
What initially got you and your parents thinking that you might have ADHD?
I think we all suspected it because many people in my family have ADHD, including my dad. So I think we kind of knew that it was going to probably be there. But I think it was when I was little, I would just go off telling random stories. And then in the middle of the random stories, I would start telling more random stories. And so as that continued as I got older, or just not being able to focus on certain things, it was kind of just all the signs pointing towards you have ADHD.
I was interviewed by actually someone over in Tennessee as well, Bailey Guy. She interviewed me for her podcast. I was her first guest. And she asked me one question. And I didn't finish answering that question until about 20 minutes later. She had asked me one question. I spoke for 20 minutes. And by the end of it, I didn't remember what a question was, and I don't think I had even answered it.
I definitely experience something very similar. I do tend to forget, but I'll be telling the story and then I'll say one word that just completely reminds me of an entirely different story. So then I start telling that one,
Yep.
and then I'll say something that brings me back to the first one, but then I'll say something else that takes me off to a different side path. Yeah, I've had to work on not forgetting what the question was and making sure I answer it through pageant prep and whatnot, because that was definitely a problem in the
Yeah.
beginning.
Your dad has ADHD and your mum does not. So is there any sort of difference that you found communicating with your dad who has the ADHD and your mum who doesn't?
Yes. My mom tends to stay very focused on whatever she's talking about and kind of not stray from that. Whereas my dad, like me, will just kind of start talking about eight different things in the one sentence. But I've noticed she sometimes has trouble keeping up when we're both talking about the same thing because we'll both be going off in different directions. So she's like, "Hold on, what were we talking about at first? Because that's we got to get back to that." Yeah, there's definitely some subtle differences, but I think because she's lived with people with ADHD for so long, sometimes she starts acting a little bit ADHD.
It's contagious. Has she developed any sort of system? And I'm going to be talking to her as well, so I can ask her, but I'm just curious from your point of view. Do you know if your mum has worked out, like, what's the best way of communicating to Clover? Or does she just communicate with you the same way that she would communicate, for example, to your sister who doesn't have the ADHD?
I think she's definitely caught on to the way that my brain works a little bit better. Obviously, if she's super busy and a little bit distracted, which is common, she'll just speak to me how she would normally. But I think she's worked out a system of saying, like, okay, Gracie can do better with just whatever I need to say, whereas Clover needs like more of a bullet point list and saying, okay, well, if I need to get
Yeah.
these 4 points across, instead of saying it in more of like a paragraph or a sentence, I'll just tell her the 4 points. And then if she asks another follow up question, I'll just answer that. I think that's kind of how she's developed it. I could be wrong, and maybe that's just how my brain's thinking she does it. But
Right.
yeah, I would say bullet points and cliff notes are a big thing that kind of helps a lot. I think kind of short, sweet, and to the point tends to do well. And also writing things down that I can look back on because, like we talked about earlier, you forget stuff. And so having something to look back to, or that's also where the bullet points come in handy though, is because I can say, okay, what were the 4 points I need to remember? And I can kind of keep revisiting those.
Mm.
Whereas if I have to kind of weed out what it is I need to do from a sentence or paragraph type structure, it's harder for me to remember and identify, I think, exactly where
Yeah.
and what I need to do.
I mean, you're only 15 and you got diagnosed August last year. Was there any particular reason that you decided or your family decided now is the right time to get Clover diagnosed?
So I got into high school earlier that year, and there was a lot more, I think. But I mean, being homeschooled, it wasn't some crazy amount that I couldn't handle. But it was more that sometimes I was having a lot of trouble focusing, and with reading assignments, I would be reading the same sentence over and over and over again, and it would take me 10 times longer than needed to do something because I just couldn't focus, or I wouldn't fully understand what a problem was asking because I just couldn't weed out exactly what it was. And I was really just having trouble focusing on what I needed to. And so we decided that maybe medication was right and to get thoroughly and officially diagnosed. So I did an online test. Well, I had a call with an official doctor and she prescribed me Ritalin. So I take it when
Yeah.
I need it, but not very often. I don't think that medication is something that I really enjoy, but I
Yep.
use it when necessary, and I think it'll be very helpful for, like, say, the SATs or things like that. It'll definitely be
Yeah.
a big help, but I don't take it on a daily basis. But I do have short release, which is really nice because then it only lasts like 3 or 4 hours. So just time to get all my schoolwork done.
Can you try to describe what it's like when you take the medication? Like what happens? I'm really curious.
For me, obviously, once it kicks in, it kind of feels like I feel like the best way I can describe it is either noise canceling headphones or shutting an airplane window. Those are the two things that I can think of to kind of describe it. It's almost like there's all this going on around you, and then when it kicks in, it's almost like blinders come on. At least that's what it feels like for me, and you can kind of focus and whatnot. But something that I didn't always love is that I like to think about what I'm going to say next as I'm talking. I didn't realize I was
Mm.
doing that until I took my medication, actually. But I realized that when I was on it, I couldn't do that. And I didn't even know that was
Oh,
something I did
wow.
until I started taking it. Yeah, it wasn't something I even noticed until I started taking it. And I was like, wait,
Oh, wow.
what am I going to say next? And I always had to like take a pause and really think about it. And I was like, I don't like that. I don't, I like not having it kind of lined up and ready. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's crazy because I was like, I remember taking it and I tried to do interview practice with my mom. And she was like, you sound
Ah.
little different. And I was like, yeah, I can't think about what I'm gonna say before I say it. And she was like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, I guess I think about what I'm gonna say next as I'm saying the first point.
Mm-hmm.
Wait,
Mm-hmm.
can neurotypical people not do this? And she was like, I've never done that before, but I mean, I guess that's cool. I was like, I don't ever want to do interview prep on Ritalin again.
That's really bizarre and funny because obviously, having done as many interviews as I have, I am always thinking ahead. And it's kind of a double-edged sword because you do want to stay present, but I'm always like thinking ahead as to where the conversation could go. Or actually, sometimes I'm thinking like 3 different variations or 10 different variations as to where I could take the interview.
Yeah, I definitely can't do any interviews on it. I don't sound very bright, if I'm being honest.
Okay. Just a follow-up question to that. I have another friend over in America, and she says I think she takes Ritalin as well, and she says it just like laser beam focus, like you said, the blinders are on. But she said the problem for her is that she cannot control the focus. Like she just gets focus in on the first thing that crosses her desk, so to speak, and then that's all she can focus on until basically the medication wears off. Now, has that been your experience as well? Like you focus, but you can't control it? Or are you actually able to say, no, I need to focus on my homework?
A little bit of both. I think because it's just kind of programmed into my brain that you take Ritalin to focus on school. So it's kind of just
Yeah.
set in stone that that's why I do it. But I was filling out paperwork for the pageant and I took it to actually be able to write something. And I remember I was trying to do something else later that day that was still related to it but different, and I couldn't. I just kept going back to the first thing. So I think yes and no. It's definitely hard to pick and choose what you
Ah,
focus
right.
on, but because certain things are programmed into my head as you do this for this, it's a little bit easier, but yeah, it's definitely a little bit difficult to control.
Have you struggled at all with any kind of emotional dysregulation? I know that I've dealt with sensory issues as an example, which sometimes lead to like basically the wrong sound. And then I just get really illogically rageful, and I'm not that person. Have you struggled at all with, I guess, either sensory issues or emotional regulation issues?
Yes, I have a lot of sensory issues, to a point where when I was little, my parents actually thought I had Asperger's. So I've definitely struggled with some sensory and emotional regulation, but I noticed that sometimes the tone that I say things at is not how it's intended in my head. Like I'll think that I'm saying something, it may be matter of fact, but still in a nice way. And then somebody be like, that was kind of mean. And I was like, what do you
Yeah.
mean? I was just trying to get my point across. I wasn't trying to be nasty at all. And I think that's something that it's just kind of hard to control is because I'm thinking about so many things at once that I can't necessarily regulate how I'm saying something. But yeah, sometimes I'll just hear something that
Yeah.
completely makes me go nuts.
Have you worked out, is there any like rhyme or reason to it? Like what sound will set you off? I mean, you already said like at times you need dead silence and other times you want music.
I think there are certain things and certain sounds that I know trigger me, but it's mostly just things in the moment that I wouldn't think about. But for example, like styrofoam, any sort of styrofoam sounds, writing
Yep.
on a chalkboard makes like my teeth chatter. I don't know what it is. But occasionally typing, but sometimes I will love the sound of typing. And so it there's
Huh.
really no rhyme or reason about it. There
Yeah.
are just certain sounds that sometimes I hate and sometimes I don't mind at all. But there are also certain things that I know trigger me, like a lot of people talking really, really loudly or like
Yeah.
really, really loud, deeper laughter. Loud laughter, normally I have no problem with, but sometimes if someone's like laughing at a certain pitch almost, like
Yeah.
it makes my brain rattle. And I don't know what it is. It's just something about it that sometimes it'll just completely trigger me and I won't be able to think or feel much. It's just one of those things that
Yeah.
sets me off.
When that happens for you, have you found like the only way that you can remedy the situation is to get away from it?
Most of the time, I do have to kind of just remove myself from whatever the scenario may be. But if it's something smaller or something that stops at some point, I can put in headphones and just turn on music and forget about it, or
Right.
try counting back from 103s, like I mentioned before. Just try almost coping mechanisms that tend to help, but a lot of the time, I just have to get out of there.
You've been homeschooled pretty much your entire life. I know that. Apart
Mhm.
from, how long did you spend in preschool? Was it 1 day, 3 days, 3 hours? I can't remember. How
It
long
was
did you spend in pre?
3 days. It was 3 days. I was mostly just mad that they wouldn't let me play surgery squad, but I practiced writing my letters instead.
How would it have worked for Clover Pfaff if she had had to go to normal school?
I don't think it would have worked well, if I'm being honest. I've always been a year ahead in school, so I think that would have been part of it because when we moved back from Haiti, I had begged for years to go to school. I think it was just because that almost like Disneyified version of school is what we all have in our heads. And so I had begged and pleaded, and so my mom was like, okay, fine, we'll see. And we had talked to a school, and they said, oh, well, because of your age, we're just going to have to put you in the grade that you would be based on your age, not because of where
Yeah.
you actually are learning at. So, well, we would just have to put you here. And I was like, well, no, that doesn't make sense. If I'm a year ahead, like just put me a year ahead. It's that easy. But they weren't going to let me. And then we found a school that would, but I had looked at their like practice tests online, and
Yeah.
it just didn't seem like that was how my brain was going to work. And it's always been something of I don't tend to do well with standardized testing, if I'm being honest. I
Okay.
recently just had to take my like driver's test, my learner's permit test. And I did my best with that and I passed, but the way that questions are asked tends to not necessarily confuse me, but that's kind of where the ADHD comes in of not knowing exactly what answer they want because the answer that I would give, I've noticed, is typically different than the answer that they're actually looking for. And it's not that
Mm-hmm.
I don't know it, it's that when I'm learning
Mm-hmm.
something, I remember my mom was like, it was years and years ago, but she was teaching me how to like properly take notes and highlight things. And she was like, and I highlighted something, she was like, why did you highlight that? And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, no, this is what they're going to want to know. And I said, but this seems like more important. And she was like, but that's not what they're going to think is more important for the test or the assignment or whatever it might be. I said, but to
Yeah.
me, this is way more important. And it was kind of that having to learn how neurotypical people take
Mm.
assignments and take material and turn it into tests or assignments, things like that, and having to almost pretend I'm neurotypical as I'm learning it to think about, okay, well, what is the information that they're going to want, not the information that you think is necessary. But I think that's where a lot of my random knowledge comes in, is thinking that for some reason I'm going to need to know something random one day, and unless I go in Jeopardy, I probably won't. But
I'm laughing as you're saying this, not because I'm laughing at you, but I'm like laughing
no,
with you because from the people, the neurodiverse people that I've spoken to, one of the defining characteristics seems to be whenever they take a test, particularly if it's a multiple choice test, they can't just take the test. They have to start thinking about like, why this test? Why are you asking this question? Why do you mean this? Like, this answer is wrong. What do you want me to answer? Like, I know what you want me to answer, but even that answer is wrong. So the correct, and like, they can't just take a test. I don't know. It's a very weird experience, but I know that because the ADHD screening test is in itself a multiple choice test. And there are
mm-hmm.
6 questions, and it asks you like scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 1 being never, 5 being always. And it asks you your question like, do you ever have problems sitting still? And I'm sitting there going, okay, I know exactly how to answer this question if I want a diagnosis of ADHD. I also know exactly what to answer if I don't want the diagnosis. So what's the point of this test? And I started getting out. I was streaming this live because I wanted to, broadcast my experience. I don't know if that was a good choice or not. And I was getting irrationally angry at this test because I just thought this test is so stupid. That's why I'm laughing, because it seems to be, I don't know what it is, but when we take those sorts of tests, and particularly, like, have you ever had that one with the multiple choice test in particular? Because that seems to be the one that trips a lot of neurodiverse people up.
Yeah, that was the one of the original tests I took. I think I had to take 2 before my actual call with the doctor. But I remember she had to go over the multiple choice questions again and have me answer them again. And she was like, on a scale from 1 to 5, like whatever. And I was like, 2 or 3. And she was like, well, which one, 2 or 3? And I said, 2.5. Like, it, like, she was like, just pick one. And I was like, I guess 3. But it's one of those things where I kept doing that. And she was like, you're gonna have to pick a number. Like, I can't do it for you. I was like, but I'm in between. But multiple choice tests for academically, I've noticed, is better for me because I can kind of say, okay, well, this is how they're gonna want. These are the 4 ways that they see that you could answer this, and I can kind of pick the one that makes the most sense. But I 100% understand what you're saying of, well, I know how I could answer this if I wanted this versus if I wanted this. And I've kind of struggled with that for a long time. I don't know if you remember those like BuzzFeed quizzes. I feel like I was weirdly obsessed with those when I was like 10 years old. I feel like everyone was at some point.
Which Harry Potter house do you belong to?
Yeah, I think I was doing like the Hunger Games or the Divergent one or something. And I was like, well, I want this one, so I'm just going to put this answer. And my sister was like, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I want to get this answer, so I'm just going to say this. And she was like, but that's lying. And I was like, but it's not lying. I can always find some truth in it.
It's a BuzzFeed test. It doesn't matter if you're being honest on a BuzzFeed test. Last question. You've written pros and cons of having ADHD.
I think the cons list is shorter, in my opinion. It's that maybe you have trouble focusing, you maybe are more forgetful, and sometimes you have to take medication. I think that would just have to be the end of my cons list. But I think that there are a lot more pros. I think there's so much more when you have ADHD. It's almost like there's a whole other world unlocked to me. I think that we're more fun, more creative. Maybe we don't tell stories quite as straightforward, but I think they're more entertaining. I think a big pro to having ADHD for me was being able to focus on different things at once. And even though sometimes it wasn't always as focused as it could be, I could multitask better. And I also love that I can listen to music and write an essay at the same time, and neither one impedes with the other. And I really enjoy that because I have a very, very musical brain. And so being able to do that makes my life so much easier and happier. So I think that, and I think that every con to ADHD comes with a pro, and maybe every pro comes with a con, but I think that anything that could be seen as negative about ADHD could also be seen as positive in a different light.
It's me again. So I hope you really enjoyed that interview. If there's any feedback that you have, I'd love to hear your comments below, whether it's how to make these sorts of interviews more ADHD friendly, or maybe even suggestions as to who you'd like to see me interview next. Now, obviously, I don't need to tell you that the best way to support this channel is to leave a like and subscribe, especially given that we're new. But I'd really also love to encourage you to join us at ADHDschool.com. That's school with a K. That's where we're going to be building a little ADHD neurodivergent community. So sign up there. Thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you very, very soon.